For nearly 3 decades, Somalia has been at the center of armed conflict waged in the country by a variety of groups. The overthrow of Siad Barre's military regime in Somalia on 27 January 1991 was the beginning of this state of chaos in Somalia. Mohamed Siad Barre's autocratic rule over Somalia began with a coup d'etat, including the murder of the former president Abdi Rashid Ali Shemake on 15 October 1969, and Siad Barre's rule would last for 22 years from 1969 to 1991. The Barre regime became increasingly oppressive and violent in the late 1970s and through the 1980s, although mass atrocities did not begin until later. In this episode of African Biographics, we look at the rise to power, eventual demise and death of Mohamed Siad Barre, as well as a brief history of socialist Somalia. While Somalia is ethnically, religiously and linguistically homogeneous, the country's population is divided into clans who can draw their lineage back to a common ancestor. During the colonial period under Italy and Great Britain, clans became a central feature of state administration and political competition. Colonial administrators established a patrimonial system of resource distribution, employed tactics of divide and rule along clan lines, and engaged in collective punishment of clans. All these tactics would be employed during the later periods of violence, including during the time when the subject of this video, Siad Barre, was in power. Siad was born around 1919 or even earlier into a nomadic family in the small Marehan clan of the Darod clan group in Italian Somaliland. He joined the Somali police force after the British took control of the country in 1941 and rose to the post of chief inspector. When Somalia was returned to Italian sovereignty in 1950, Siad was sent to the military academy in Italy. He later transferred to the Somali National Army when it was formed in 1960. By 1966, Siad Barre held the rank of Major General and had become the Commander-in-Chief of the army. The country of Somalia was formed in 1960 when British Somaliland gained its independence from Britain and joined with its much larger neighbor, Italian Somaliland. The northern and southern regions were united under a multi-party democracy that lasted from 1960 to 1969. After independence in Somalia, successive, fairly tolerant but complacent civilian regimes made the mistake of ignoring mounting public displeasure, especially over corruption levels. So it came as no surprise that members of the army staged a coup d'etat and took power. On the morning of October 21, 1969, in the young Somali Republic, Radio Mogadishu had been playing unusual militaristic music most of the morning, deviating from its usual programming, which normally began with a roundup of world news. On a side note, the same thing of having military music playing on the radio to signify an ongoing coup d'etat happened when the military took over power in Zimbabwe in November of 2017. So in Somalia during this period, just a week earlier, the incumbent Somalian president, Abdi Rashid Ali Shemake, had been assassinated in what some historians believe was an act encouraged by the Soviet Union. The government was informed that it had been dissolved by the military. The public enthusiastically welcomed the coup d'etat, and only several days later would it become known that Siad Barre was the mastermind of the whole operation, which ended Somalia's short-lived and hopeful but troubled democratic era. Significant political figures were detained, the constitution suspended, the National Assembly closed, political parties banned, and the Supreme Court abolished. The country was renamed the Somali Democratic Republic, and on the 1st of November 1969, the conspirators of the coup constituted themselves as the Supreme Revolutionary Council. When Siad Barre took power in 1969, he sought and obtained support from the Soviet Union and embraced scientific socialism for Somalia. Among his first steps were to abolish Somalia's clan and patronage system, as he called it counter-revolutionary. A national campaign against tribalism, corruption, nepotism, and misrule was launched, and even informal references to clan alliances were outlawed. A new intelligence agency, the National Security Service, was established in 1970 to monitor security offenses that included nepotism and tribalism. Siad Barre's early rule did have some positive aspects, such as the establishment of the first written script for the Somali language, a nationwide literacy campaign, and the empowerment of women through fair marriage, divorce, and inheritance laws. The other positive that came out was the way that the Siad Barre regime dealt with droughts in Somalia, and this helped prevent wide-scale famine. During his early days in power, there were healthcare improvements as well as the provision of better infrastructure. The foreign policy of the Somali government in Africa was about supporting both materially and morally numerous independence movements that were happening across the continent. However, Siad Barre's government soon degenerated into increasing dictatorship, repression, and a personality cult focused around the leader, Siad Barre, who established an increasingly repressive and authoritarian security state, placing himself in control of all facets of state power. However, his government would suffer a serious blow when he launched an unsuccessful military invasion of the ethnic Somali Ogaden region of Ethiopia in 1977. In 1977, Ethiopia and Somalia engaged in a brief territory conflict over the Ogaden region situated between and claimed by both nations. This conflict, however, held greater significance than most territorial disputes because Ethiopia was backed by the Soviet Union and Somalia was supported by the United States, thus bringing the Cold War to the Horn of Africa. Both superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, saw Ethiopia and Somalia as crucial to control the narrow eastern access to the Red Sea, which both countries border. Long before the 1977 conflict, the Ogaden region had been subject to dispute. After the Italian conquest of Ethiopia in 1936, Ogaden was attached to Italian Somaliland, becoming the Somalia governorate within the new colony. Following the British conquest of this colony, the Anglo-Ethiopian Agreement placed Ogaden under temporary British control. The British sought to unite Ogaden with British Somaliland and the former Italian Somaliland to realize Greater Somalia, and this was supported by many Somalis. Ethiopia unsuccessfully pleaded before the London Conference of the Allied Powers to gain the Ogaden region and Eritrea in 1945. But their persistent negotiations and pressure from the United States eventually persuaded the British to cede Ogaden to Ethiopia in 1948. Fast forward to when Somalia gained independence in 1960, border conflict and internal unrest in Ogaden resumed. The Western Somalia Liberation Front would use guerrilla tactics to resist Ethiopian rule in Ogaden. The Army of Somalia, under instruction from Siad Barre, invaded and occupied the Ogaden region in the second half of 1977 with encouragement from some of the indigenous Somali population in Ogaden. During this whole time previously, Ethiopia had been aligned with the United States, but after the Derg military junta seized power in 1974, the Soviet Union began supporting Ethiopia and sent arms and military advisors. Cuba's Fidel Castro provided an additional 13,000 troops and Ethiopia repelled the Somali army in 1978. The 1977 to 1978 war between Somalia and Ethiopia over the Ogaden region and the eventual defeat of Somalia altered the military balance of forces in the Horn of Africa in favor of the victorious country, Ethiopia. Consequently, it was Somalia's defeat in the Ogaden War that compounded and fast-tracked the process of collapse in this country of Somalia. After the war, Somalia was by then awash with weapons of war. The military regime was not capable of exercising control over the entire country, and the clan-affiliated military resistance against the Siad Barre regime increased. Somalia's Ogaden War with Ethiopia revealed weaknesses in Siad Barre's leadership and his hollow authority. Also livid at the Soviet support for Ethiopia, Siad Barre abandoned scientific socialism and he switched sides, allying himself with the United States, and he also sought refuge increasingly in the support of his Darod clan. In January of 1981, former United States Secretary of State Henry Kissinger visited the presidential palace in Mogadishu, hoping to further strengthen the United States-Somalia ties. Siad Barre had criticized the previous United States President Jimmy Carter for not backing his country against the Soviet Union. But now Henry Kissinger was convincing the then President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, to view Somalia as a crucial front for the United States-Soviet Union Cold War confrontation. In the 1983 budget, Ronald Reagan requested $91 million in military and economic assistance for Somalia, plus another $18 million in food aid for refugees. That year, Somalia's GDP was less than $750 million. However, later on, reports from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the press about the atrocities that were being committed by the Barre regime led to a sharp reduction in the United States' aid to Somalia by late 1989. As I mentioned earlier, after the Ogaden War, the people in Somalia were not so happy and the Siad Barre regime was heavily in debt. Internal squabbles came out in the open, factionalism became rife, and Siad Barre's government started to deteriorate and his authoritarianism turned openly brutal. The increasing clan bases of Siad Barre's regime led to the formation of opposition fronts that were similarly clan-focused, as Nandarod clan felt excluded from power. One of the first setbacks to Barre came in 1981 when his attempts to undermine the economic and political power of the Isaac clan led to the formation of the Isaac-dominated Somali National Movement, the SNM. The SNM was developed in response to state marginalization and abuse, including the purge of the Isaac clan from civil service posts, confiscation of their businesses, arrests, detention, as well as violence against this clan. Throughout the 1980s, the Siad Barre regime responded to these oppositional militias by employing increasingly violent and restrictive measures on the various clan populations. Beginning in 1982, the state imposed curfews in certain areas that were used as a pretense for the detainment and extortion of civilians. Detainment and looting became a lucrative source of funding for state forces and paramilitaries. The SNM soon began launching small-scale attacks against the government and military posts inside of Somalia. Siad Barre responded to this with what Human Rights Watch described as savage counterinsurgency tactics, ordering massive bombardments of northern towns and villages. Between 1987 and 1989, the regime of the Somali dictator Siad Barre massacred an estimated 200,000 members of the Isaac tribe, the largest clan group in the northwest part of Somalia. This campaign led to the internal displacement of some 500,000 northerners, with another 500,000 seeking refuge in Ethiopia. Because of this genocide, it is said that there are more than 200 mass graves in Somaliland, most of them in the area known as the Valley of Death. In its final years, Siad Barre's government steadily lost control of much of the countryside to the chiefs of the warring clans, plunging the country into social and economic problems. Human rights groups issued reports citing a consistent pattern of political imprisonment, torture, political killings, and discrimination against several clans. In May of 1986, President Siad Barre was seriously injured in an automobile accident, but later that year, he was nominated by the country's sole legal political party for re-election. He ran uncontested and won a new 7-year term. Yet there continued to be questions about the extent of his recovery. Reports of feeble health combined with the country's internal strife led to a weakening of his grasp on power. It is said that towards the end of his rule, he was struggling to arrange a successor that would ensure that his family and clan remained in power. This regime continued to launch targeted reprisals against the civilian population throughout 1990. Siad Barre's presidential brigade, the Red Berets, were responsible for civilian executions in and around Mogadishu. In one incident, the Red Berets killed 100 civilians gathered in a stadium. But the writing for Siad Barre was on the wall. In January of 1991, Siad fled Mogadishu as armed opposition movements took over Somalia. He twice failed to retake Mogadishu with the armed forces of his Marehan clan, and he fled to Kenya and then to Nigeria. The former dictator fled in a tank filled with reserves from the Somalian Central Bank. This included gold and foreign currency estimated to have been worth $27 million. Barre died of a heart attack on January 2, 1995 in Lagos, Nigeria. The overthrow of Siad Barre's military regime in Somalia on 27 January 1991 was the beginning of the civil war in Somalia. The situation was further exacerbated by the massive displaced Somali refugees fleeing the civil war that had begun in Mogadishu, the capital city of Somalia. 4 months later, Somaliland broke away from Somalia. While Somalia collapsed into more than 2 decades of civil war, Somaliland gradually developed better security, a livestock trade, its own currency, and democratic elections. Let me know in the comment section below what your thoughts are on Siad Barre's time in power. If you are new here and are interested in similar content, then don't be shy to subscribe and to click the notifications bell so that you don't miss out on any new uploads. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.